I think that women's only martial arts classes are bad, and probably not for the reason you think. Rob from Combat Self-Defense made a video that touched on and defended women's only gyms. You can go watch his video here. While I completely agree that men's only classes are stupid, I also think that women's only classes are counterproductive to women's inclusion in martial arts, and they're harmful to martial arts in general. To explain why, I first want to provide a suspiciously large amount of background knowledge so that you understand the perspective I'm coming from. And I promise that it's all relevant. We're going to touch on moral philosophy, race-based public policy, and even economic incentives in choosing a gym. To understand the best way for women to learn martial arts, let's briefly discuss how learning in martial arts actually happens. A common misconception is that knowledge transfers from the instructor to the student. The instructor shows you a move and you master it through repetition in drills and sparring. This is absolutely not how learning happens and couldn't be further from the truth. The point of joining a martial arts gym is not so you can have someone show you a move. I can see moves on YouTube for free. The point of a gym is to have a community of people to practice against. Learning happens when you adapt your strategies and techniques to overcome resistance. The more diverse the types of resistance you're able to encounter, the more you'll be able to learn. For example, I might go with someone and try and use one of the moves that I saw on YouTube recently. Then they adjust their balance, posture, and tactics to shut down my move. This forces me to adjust my tactics to overcome their defense, and that cycle continues until we've each learned how to make dozens of small tweaks that allow our moves to become much more effective. And each person I spar against will require me to make different adjustments to my game in order to beat them. The more experienced someone is, the more tweaks I have to know to win, because my tweaks have to overcome all of their tweaks. When I have a larger pool of more diverse training partners, it forces me to figure out a larger number of tweaks to my moves in order to overcome all of those different strategies. The goal here is not to perform moves correctly. It's to learn how to adapt and problem solve. Turns out, Joe Rogan's definition of fighting is pretty accurate.
It's high-level problem solving with dire physical consequences.
In addition to this, anytime I roll with someone, we're able to give each other feedback. We tell each other what the other person did right, what they did wrong, and potentially how they can do it better. And when I have more skilled and experienced training partners, I get better feedback on ways to improve. Oftentimes, we'll even show each other entirely new moves or strategies that could be implemented into the other person's game. That kind of problem solving and peer feedback is what drives a large portion of learning in martial arts. The more training partners I have access to, the better I'll be able to get. And the more knowledgeable people I can train with, the better my feedback will be. However, all of the people in my gym that challenge me, give me feedback, and force me to make adjustments to my game are men. It's not that women can't do these things, it's just that there aren't a lot of women in martial arts. Martial arts, like many other disciplines, is a numbers game. The more training partners you have, and the more diverse your experience, the better you'll be. The more members a gym has, the more classes they run, then the more training opportunities everyone in the gym will have access to. The more people in martial arts, the more people there are to innovate new solutions to problems. This is how pretty much every facet of society progresses. The more unique minds with different viewpoints working on the same problem, the faster that problem gets solved. Inclusion is good not just for individuals, but also for the entire community. Now, before we get into why this matters for women in martial arts, we have to spend just a few minutes talking about the effects of segregation in general. I'm going to be using Jim Crow era racial segregation as a framework, mainly because it's a well-studied historical example that I'm reasonably educated on. And for those of you outside the US, Jim Crow refers to the series of racist laws and policies used to oppress racial minorities in the US throughout much of the 19th and 20th century. I promise that all of these points are both relevant and integral to my argument, as weird as that sounds. But note that I'm only covering the parts that can be used as a framework for understanding resource allocation in martial arts. I am not covering the full breadth of how oppression works. Just bear with me, and it'll all make sense. Now, on a foundational level, when two groups with identical numbers, resources, and starting positions are separated from each other, we can reasonably expect their growth and performance over time to be relatively similar to each other, all else being equal. However, when one group has more members, more resources, or an otherwise better starting position, that would give them a pretty obvious long-run advantage. In the Jim Crow South, and technically still today, white people were the majority of the population, while also possessing a disproportionate amount of the money. This meant that white schools and white businesses had access to all of the money and resources they could possibly need, and black schools and businesses didn't. White schools being well-funded meant that they got good education, which led to those kids growing up and earning even more money. White businesses had a larger pool of potential customers than black businesses, allowing new businesses with niche products to spring up that could make people's lives easier. And white people earning money meant that they could spend more money at white businesses, which could then grow and hire more staff, which gave more white people more well-paying jobs that allowed them to spend more money at white businesses and provide more funding to white schools. It formed a feedback loop that allowed white people to do very well. However, black schools and businesses suffered because the black community didn't have enough money to spend on them. And the smaller number of black people meant that black businesses had fewer potential customers, and both black businesses and schools couldn't benefit as much from economies of scale. Businesses were prevented from forming because there might not be enough of a customer base to support a niche product. And when customers still needed those niche products, they would have to spend more money shipping the product longer distances, meaning that the group with less resources is also forced to allocate those resources less efficiently. Even without other racist laws, taxes, or glass ceilings, minority populations are permanently disadvantaged just from the mere fact of being separated from the majority. Now, you could attempt to even out this disparity by artificially pumping a bunch of extra money into the black community while praying that you manage to allocate it effectively, or you could just integrate the communities. If white and black people are attending the same schools, shopping at the same businesses, and working the same jobs, a lot of that inequality can even out over time. It won't solve all the problems, because racism doesn't just boil down to economics, but it's a pretty good start. Plus, more money and resources circulating in a larger overall community means that even the majority community is better off. Becoming a big fish is only possible if your pond has enough resources for you to grow. That's why whales don't live in small lakes. Now, integration is great, but racists decided to propose another idea. You may remember the separate but equal doctrine. It stated that you could have separate schools, businesses, and restrooms for black and white people, but they had to be equal. The facilities for black people had to be just as good as the facilities for white people. Of course, in practice, they never were. The separate but equal doctrine was eventually overturned in a series of Supreme Court decisions that looked at the evidence and rightly concluded that separation clearly and inevitably perpetuates and furthers inequality, even when you provide them with the same resources. And that's partially because the majority group is the resource. For example, back in Jim Crow era, if someone went to a black law school, it doesn't matter how much funding their school got. The sheer number of white people means that the white law school is bigger. Bigger schools mean more professors with more diverse viewpoints and teaching methods, a larger number of class choices, and far more networking opportunities. The majority school is where most future lawyers, judges, and law professors are going to be, and developing relationships with those people is key to having a career in law. Without access and integration into the majority community, you fundamentally cannot give minorities equal resources, because the majority group itself is a resource. Keeping groups separate is inherently unequal. Now, many of you have probably noticed that even the repeal of Jim Crow laws and the separate but equal doctrine failed to make the US a post-racial paradise. And we can certainly assign part of the blame to racist power structures and persistent implicit biases. But That's outside the scope of this video, and probably this entire channel. Instead, there's another element of this story that's surprisingly important. Segregation never went away. You see, human beings have a strong tendency to self-segregate. People will divide themselves into groups by sex, race, age, favorite flavor of ice cream, you name it, even when it's against their own interest. Today, US schools and communities are often just as segregated as they were under Jim Crow. And it's not because integration programs failed. It's because integration worked, but then we stopped doing it, and society almost immediately segregated itself even harder, despite legally enforced segregation having long since been repealed. In fact, the pinnacle of racial integration in the United States was years before I was ever born. And US schools are now at their lowest level of racial integration since 1968. And this isn't just a result of white flight. Research has indicated that racial minorities tend to cluster themselves into specific communities, schools, and neighborhoods just as often as white people do. The moment the government stopped forcibly integrating schools, they started to segregate again. When no one is working to actively integrate a population, that population will segregate itself. You can see this on the national level all the way down to individual rooms of people. In college, my psychology professor was giving a lecture on this human tendency to self-segregate while our classroom was currently segregated by sex, with all of the women on one side of the room and all of the men on the other side. The desire to cluster together with the people that look like you is part of human nature, but that desire is not without harm. Societies and organizations often have to work really hard to integrate their members because allowing people to stay segregated often creates really bad outcomes. In fact, majority groups are harmed by segregation just as often as minority groups are. The pain simply isn't as acute. Now, the real question becomes, how does this apply to women's classes in martial arts? Well, women's only spaces are, by default, going to have a much smaller selection of training partners or more advanced resources. As Rob correctly pointed out in his video, men are the vast majority of martial arts practitioners, which means they're also likely to be the vast majority of advanced practitioners. However, the reality is even worse than that. Men also tend to be more competitively motivated. This means that they're more likely to care about success, status, and winning when it comes to martial arts. This results in men being disproportionately represented among advanced practitioners. I've been around the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts community for about a decade now, and I have never met a female black belt. I know they exist, I've seen them on TV, but they're so uncommon that I've never actually seen one. It's not that women can't be black belts, it's just a numbers game. There aren't a lot of women in martial arts, and a lower percentage of them care about getting really, really good at it. So when you look at the black belts and other advanced practitioners, the number of women in that category is basically a rounding error. Most advanced practitioners in any combat sport are going to be men. When you take men out of an environment, you are also removing all of the resources, skills, knowledge, and experience that those men bring to the room. In some fields where women are better represented, this might not matter as much, but in martial arts, men hold the vast majority of skills, knowledge, and experience. And the only way for women to gain those resources for themselves is to train and interact with the men. If men have all the resources and you don't interact with men, how do you expect to get the resources? For a fairly apt comparison, let's look to the fitness industry and the rise of women's-only gyms there. Women's-only exercise gyms often get very good reviews from the people attending them, with many clients enjoying the different, more relaxed atmosphere. And if all we care about is how comfortable the atmosphere is, then there is a strong argument for all kinds of demographic separation. But being comfortable with an atmosphere doesn't mean you're getting good outcomes. In fact, it's usually the opposite. In women's-only gyms, there are often lighter weights, less racks, and less machines because not as many women require them when compared to men. Even some of the most well-known names in the fitness industry have gyms that make Planet Fitness look like Gold's. This means that it becomes difficult, if not impossible, for someone to get past a certain ceiling of fitness in many women's only gyms, effectively putting a cap on their progress. They simply don't have access to the equipment or resources that both men and women typically need to get jacked. If you want to be halfway passable at a martial art, you can do that basically anywhere. If you want to actually get good at fighting, you need to interact with men. Ultimately, you have to choose whether you want to be with people just like you or whether you want to be good at martial arts. In his video, Rob talks about the difference between equality and equity and suggests that we can battle gender inequality by giving women more resources to compensate for their lower starting circumstances. But attempting to give women more classes, greater training time, or better instructors is still setting them up for failure. Do you remember the section in this video about how learning happens in martial arts? It's not about training time or which instructor you have. It's about the quality and diversity of your training partners. Attempting to train in an environment where you are purposely isolated from the majority of potential training partners and the vast majority of advanced training partners makes it nigh impossible to ever become good at a martial art, for the same reason that it's hard to succeed at a segregated law school. The majority group is the resource. And trying to succeed without access to the majority group is like trying to raise a whale in my bathtub. You simply don't have the space or resources to succeed. What women's only martial arts spaces tend to do is funnel women into a place that systematically hampers their progress. And this is most notable when it comes to self-defense. One of the earliest points that Rob made in his video was about why people learn martial arts in the first place. I think he hit the nail on the head when he said that the reason most people start martial arts is for self-defense.
Why do most people start training in martial arts? Something has happened in a person's life that made them believe they need to learn self-defense. They might stay for a whole bunch of different reasons, but the reason they started was to learn to protect themselves.
The problem comes when you ask yourself, who do women want to defend themselves from? Other women? No. They want to be able to fend off men. So if you put them in a space where they never practice against men, you've put a hard ceiling on their progress. If you've never sparred someone that physically outclasses you, then I promise you that you're not ready for it. It's a scary feeling. And if the first time you ever experience the strength of a full-grown man is during a real violent attack, then nothing you have ever learned is going to be remotely helpful. Telling women that you'll teach them to defend themselves from men and then inviting them into a space where it's literally impossible for them to learn or practice against men is just false advertising. It's like trying to teach someone to swim on dry land and then telling them to go jump in the ocean. You fundamentally cannot deliver on the results you promised. Now, many people might push back on the notion that women need to train with men by saying that training with men means that women are more likely to get injured. But if the smaller people in your room are routinely getting hurt, that's not because the presence of testosterone is injuring them. It's because you have a gym culture that's allowing injuries to happen. When someone trains with a smaller, weaker person, they should adjust their force to whatever their partner can handle. I've seen heavyweights train with literal children just fine. If your students are injuring people, you don't have a gender problem. You have a culture problem. In addition, while the intention of women's only gyms is to get a larger number of women in the martial arts community, it can also end up removing them from the community. You see, there are three kinds of women that will take martial arts classes. The ones that will only go to a women's only class, the ones that would prefer a women's only class but are willing to go to either, and the ones that prefer a mixed gender class. When you create separate spaces for women, you pull in the first group, but you also end up removing the second group from the mixed gender classes. You're not just creating new female martial arts practitioners, you're also creating a crowding out effect that shrinks the total number of women in the normal classes. When you do this, it results in less total women in the mixed gender classes. And that makes the women that remain there feel even less welcome and less comfortable. Plus, it means that the space is even more male dominated, and that men will be less inclined to make the training environment inclusive to women because there are so few women anyway. In addition, instructors will have less incentives to make their co-ed classes welcoming to women because there's effectively less demand for the stuff women want. This risks creating a feedback loop until women's gyms and classes become the only space that women have left. Real equality is about getting a seat at the table. If we invite you to your own special, smaller table and stick you in a different room, we didn't give you a seat at the table. We put you at the kids' table, and you should probably feel insulted. Now, obviously, having optional women's classes isn't nearly as morally reprehensible as forced segregation, and I don't mean to imply otherwise. However, just because you're not enforcing segregation doesn't mean you're not causing segregation. Remember that humans self-segregate pretty much every chance they get, even when doing so creates negative outcomes for them. Human beings are highly susceptible to destroying their long-term success in the name of short-term comfort. That's why ice cream exists. Offering a chance for minority populations to trap themselves into a resource-poor community might not count as enforcing segregation, but it very much does help it along. You're simply providing people an extra tool with which to install a thicker glass ceiling above their heads. Sure, you're giving people more choices and options for comfort that they might not have had before, but I'm pretty sure a drug dealer could make the same argument. Even if you try and give the minority group more resources, you can never fully account for the fact that segregation from the majority group is inherently unequal. When you have a women's-only space in martial arts, you are effectively depriving those students access to the majority of martial arts resources, which are currently possessed by men. You're not fixing inequality, you're perpetuating it, because isolating minority populations into social and economic silos is a devastatingly effective way to stop them from succeeding. And to me, the weirdest combination is when you have a women's-only class that's taught by a man. Not only do you get all the downsides of segregating the women off from male training partners, but you completely failed to make a women's-only space. It's women's empowerment in a way where a man still has all the power. This is like putting me, the whitest man alive, in charge of an NAACP chapter. It kind of defeats the point, doesn't it? However, this also comes down to why women would want their own space in martial arts. And the reasons given tend to revolve around intensity, social behavior, and the physical differences between men and women. Essentially, training with men is uncomfortable. And the problem with segregated martial arts classes is that they have two mutually exclusive goals: make students comfortable and get students good at martial arts. But fighting is inherently uncomfortable, and getting good at it necessitates discomfort. The more comfortable we make it, the less effective it's likely to be. And I do want to be clear that this is not a problem unique to women in any way. Martial artists of both genders hit plateaus in their training because they want to be comfortable. They use the same moves against the same training partners, accept the same results, and never challenge themselves. And I fully understand that people want to have some comfort, but it starts to be a problem when you have entire classes or even entire gyms being built around comfort instead of being built around learning. In addition, I acknowledge that women's classes don't actually make someone worse at martial arts. Someone going to co-ed classes would probably progress slower than someone else going to the exact same classes plus a women's class. Even if it's not the best training, it's still training. But if women's only classes start to replace parts of your normal schedule, I would expect your progress to slow down. And if your training is exclusively women's only classes, let's be honest, you can't fight. So attending a women's class every once in a while isn't going to ruin your training for the same reason that having fast food every once in a while isn't what makes you fat. It just means that you want to treat yourself to an occasional comfort. But while I've been using women's classes and women's gyms somewhat interchangeably, having a women's only class be 10% of your training or 100% of your training will yield very different outcomes. One could be viewed as treating yourself to an occasional burger, and the other is the martial arts equivalent of supersize me. But while having an occasional comfort might be a more reasonable justification for a women's class, it's an equally good justification for a men's only class. And then the question becomes whether you think both should exist or neither should exist. Now, please note that I'm not saying that women have to put up with bullying, sexism, or toxic training environments just to deserve the chance to learn martial arts. We should genuinely examine the reason these women's only spaces pop up and what market needs they're attempting to fill. Even if a given woman is willing to embrace the kind of discomfort that comes with learning to fight, there still might be legitimate reasons that she would seek out a women's only class. Broadly, there are two possible reasons that an instructor might feel that they need to create a women's only gym or class. Either it's because the existing spaces are hostile to women, or it's because you're catering to that subset of women that don't want to train with men. And both of these reasons are bad. If the existing martial arts spaces are hostile to women, the answer is not to put women somewhere else. It's to improve the existing spaces. If a school is hostile to black students, making a separate school for the black kids is the wrong answer. The correct answer is to remove the people making it hostile. You kick out the perpetrators, not the victims. If women can't stand to be in your class, you don't need to make a separate class for women. You need to ask yourself why they can't stand to be in your class. If you can't create an open and welcoming environment for female students, then you need to rethink your business model and gym culture. And if you don't know how to change your gym culture, don't worry, I made a video on that too. However, while fixing the class might be possible for an instructor, a woman in the class might have less options. If the instructor doesn't care about addressing their toxic environment, then I fully agree that sucks. But my first reaction would be to see if you can find a less toxic co-ed gym instead of simply joining the segregated class and continuing to give the toxic gym your money. After all, if your area is large enough to support a women's only martial arts class, it's probably big enough to have more than one martial arts gym. Now, the other justification for creating a women's only space is that you could be catering to the women that are uncomfortable training with men for any number of a wide variety of reasons. They've had bad experiences, they're afraid of men, their religion forbids it, they have different training goals for men, they want to work with someone of their own size and abilities, they don't like the vibe of the gym, or they're just uncomfortable around men in general. Maybe they saw that TikTok trend about the woods and they chose the bear. Now, you might think that some or all of these are perfectly legitimate reasons to not train with men. The problem is that men tend to give the exact same reasons for not wanting to train with women. And if two groups are complaining of the exact same problem and they want the exact same thing for the exact same reasons, then they're either both sexist or they're both valid. And it will be a cold day in July before I say that having a men's only gym is valid. Women can't be sexist because they lack institutionalized power. Oh, do you want women to have power? Then you should still be against women's only gyms. Please refer to the thing you just watched. Honestly, anyone that can't tolerate interacting with half of the population shouldn't be in martial arts. They should be in therapy. If you have a woman that is too scared of or disgusted by men to interact with them in a controlled and welcoming environment, then teaching that woman to defend themselves from men is a fool's errand. Learning to fight is about embracing discomfort and overcoming adversity. If you can't overcome the adversity of having to interact with a man, then you definitely don't have the mental fortitude to fight one off. But the problems don't end there. If women have their own designated spaces, ask yourself what signal that sends to the men, who are the vast majority of practitioners. It sends the signal that we don't need to include women in our spaces. Why would we bother bending over backwards to make sure women feel comfortable in our class? That's what the women's class is for. If you're uncomfortable, just go to a different gym. As you can probably guess, this can be a little not good for women's inclusion. Having a space for women implies that the other spaces are not for women, and men will often act accordingly. Rob correctly points out that men are often viewed as the default in martial arts. And the last thing we should do is to officially codify that default into our training environments. Also, I want to be clear that women are not the only ones negatively affected by this, and that men should care about this debate as well. When you separate a majority and minority populations, the minority is cut off from the knowledge and resources of the majority. But the majority is also cut off from the minority's knowledge and resources. Women tend to have different physical builds, greater flexibility, a different mindset approach to martial arts, and a different perspective and experience regarding martial arts. Now, I acknowledge that this is largely anecdotal, but most experienced instructors will tell you that women in martial arts learn, act, and fight differently than most men do. I roll with women and I suddenly have to deal with their bizarre contortions and a preference for lower body strength over upper body strength that I've simply never had a male training partner ever do. Women can exploit openings I didn't know I had, and they can simply shrug off some moves that would send most men to the hospital. Just rolling with Kaylin made me realize that my triangles weren't tight enough because her skinny little swan neck just wasn't being choked. Remember that the best way to learn is to solve novel problems. And if you typically train with men, then training with women is a great way to experience different problems. And their different physical abilities and perspective means they're often able to give different kinds of feedback than many men will give. When women get de facto segregated into their own space, they might suffer the most, but men lose out as well. Everyone benefits from integration, and everyone loses from segregation. Now, personally, I think I did a pretty good job at covering a wide range of arguments, but some people might disagree with some of the assumptions I made or a particular outlook that I have. So I wanted to take a minute to address some possible counter-arguments. Some of the men out there might be thinking, why do I have to make accommodations for women? I want to roll hard, not train with some weakling that's gonna cry whenever I do a teeny little bit of strength. Well, first of all, have you never trained with a man smaller or weaker than you? If you have, do you just go 100% and constantly injure them? Or do you back off to something they can handle and you can both benefit from? Because if you've never had to go easy on people to help protect them and let them learn, that means that you are the weakest and least skilled person in your gym. And everyone you train with is actually going easy on you. And if people have been willing to help you get where you are today, why aren't you willing to do the same for other people? Martial arts classes are a collaborative learning environment. If your priority is to be as selfish as possible, then maybe you shouldn't be there. Okay, but why should I as a business owner feel the need to manage a specific gym culture that makes women feel accepted? After all, women are a small minority of martial artists anyway, and I'm trying to create a room of killers. If women can't take the heat, they should stay out of the kitchen. Alright, there's a few possibilities here. It's possible that you've created a gym environment that's too rough and tumble for women, but doing that also excludes older men, boys, and basically anyone that's not a 20-something athlete. One of the women in my gym has so much grit and drive that making the class too rough and tumble for her would also exclude literally everyone else, including all of the men. If our gym kept getting more rough and tumble, she'd be the last one to quit. If your class is too rough for literally all women, then I'm surprised you have enough members to stay open. It's a lot more likely that your class is hostile to women, and you're just not being honest with yourself. And if your class is hostile to women, whether it be from offensive jokes, sexual harassment, or just blatant girls don't belong in martial arts attitude, then I bet you wouldn't tolerate that nearly as well if it were directed against you. If there were a gay guy in class that constantly sexually harassed you, you'd probably make him leave. If you went to a gym with all people of a different race and they kept jokingly calling you slurs, you wouldn't think it's very funny. And remember that you're not just driving away women. You're driving away anyone that refuses to abide discrimination. And if you only surround yourself with people that accept sexual harassment and discrimination, then don't be surprised when you one day become the target of it, because nobody around you will defend you either. Of course, maybe you're not an absolute jerk like those hypothetical people. Maybe you're a feminist that thinks my whole comfort versus learning thing is hogwash, and that women deserve a martial arts space where they can feel comfortable. But, as I pointed out earlier, men tend to give the same reasons for not training with women as women give for not training with men. If one is valid, the other is also valid, and I highly doubt that those that care about preserving women's spaces would also like a bunch of "no girls allowed" signs appearing on martial arts gyms. If you set the precedent that people can have their own exclusive spaces for martial arts, you have to acknowledge that men are the vast majority of martial artists, and it's entirely possible that a good number of those spaces will be exclusively male spaces, either because of explicit rules or because of implicit norms. And we can probably agree that's not going to help women. And the only way to really justify the idea that women should be able to have their own spaces but men shouldn't is by taking the stance that women's perspectives are valid and that men's inherently aren't. And if you believe that, why are you here? This whole channel is a man's perspective. I'm a man. Unsubscribe. Now, some longtime viewers might be wondering why I'm advocating for exclusively co-ed classes, yet in my video on transgender fighters, I defended the concept of exclusive women's divisions, and I even proposed the idea of men competing in an open division, which would surely reinforce men as the default and women as the weird exception that needs to go somewhere else. So, do I want integration or not? First of all, great question, and thank you for watching my other videos. Second of all, there are important differences between cooperative endeavors and competitive endeavors. In a competitive endeavor, we're trying to measure the skills and abilities of each individual. This means controlling for other variables, size, age, sex, experience, etc., so we can see, all else being equal, who's better. However, in cooperative endeavors, such as training, those variables are irrelevant because we're all on the same team. Sex, age, size, and a host of other factors no longer matter because we're all pulling in the same direction towards the same goal, becoming better martial artists. Having access to a diverse collection of people and resources is beneficial in training because it's what allows you to get better. In competition, we divide people up so that everybody has a chance to compete. In training, we combine people together so that everyone has the maximum amount of resources with which to learn. At the end of the day, we all want to get good at martial arts, but creating separate spaces for women hurts their progress in martial arts by limiting their opportunities for learning and crushing their access to resources. And this allegedly voluntary separation can also have social and psychological repercussions that often makes it seem less voluntary than you might expect. Not only does this hamper women's progress in martial arts, but it hampers men's progress as well. The rise of women's-only martial arts classes and gyms is well-intentioned, but I think it's a harmful trend. The best thing we can do for the martial arts community is to create open and welcoming spaces where people of both sexes can learn and thrive. And the good news is, women's-only gyms and classes are so incredibly rare, they're probably never going to have an effect on anything.
Look at this kid, he's an idiot. I bet that he can't even fight, 'cause my Krav Maga skills could totally kill. Only my school does martial arts right.